In 2007, police discovered a handwritten list in the hideout of Salvatore Lo Piccolo that astonished investigators and journalists around the world. Hidden in the Sicilian boss's refuge were 10 commandments, actual rules, that governed one of history's most secretive organizations. Rules like no one can present himself directly to another. There must be a third person, and money cannot be appropriated if it belongs to others. The list gave the public a very clear, written snapshot of rules that investigators had long suspected existed. But what's truly fascinating isn't what these rules said, it's how they revealed the sophisticated governance system that had been operating in the shadows for over a century. To understand how this system took root, we need to travel back to Sicily in the 1860s, a sun-baked island caught between two worlds as the old feudal system crumbled like ancient stone. For centuries, Sicilian nobles had ruled vast estates through a network of bailiffs and private armies, but Italian unification swept away these traditional power structures overnight. What remained was a landscape dotted with wealthy citrus groves, olive orchards, and cattle ranches, all sitting vulnerable in a legal wilderness where fewer than 350 active policemen served the entire island. The vacuum left behind created opportunities that desperate men quickly recognized. Leaseholders called gabellati, who ran estates for absentee owners, faced a choice that would shape Sicily's future. They could watch helplessly as their property disappeared to roving bands of brigands and cattle rustlers, or they could hire armed guards to protect their investments. Over time, some of those guards became the first cosche. These weren't ordinary security guards, they were men who understood that violence, applied correctly, could solve problems that laws and courts couldn't handle. In the fertile valleys around Palermo and the lemon groves of the Conca d'Oro, these hired protectors began to notice something interesting. A single guard could collect wages from multiple landowners in the same area, creating overlapping zones of influence. The work itself was straightforward: intimidate potential thieves, recover stolen livestock, and settle disputes between neighbors through methods that didn't involve lengthy court proceedings. But the real money came when these guards realized they could charge protection fees from everyone in their territory, not just their original employers. Small groups, called cosche, began forming around men who possessed the right combination of charisma, ruthlessness, and local connections. These weren't random criminal gangs, they were organized units that offered a complete package of services to rural communities. The transformation from legitimate security work to territorial control happened gradually, almost imperceptibly. Guards who started by protecting specific estates began expanding their influence to cover entire neighborhoods and villages. They discovered they could essentially tax everyone within their boundaries, not just wealthy landowners, but small shopkeepers, farmers, and anyone else conducting business in their area. What made this system work was the genuine service these groups provided alongside their demands for payment. They really did protect people from bandits and thieves. They really did settle disputes quickly and efficiently. They really did maintain a form of order in areas where the official government had little presence or authority. This combination of coercion and genuine utility made resistance difficult because people were paying for something they actually needed. The cosche leaders understood something that would become fundamental to mafia operations' reputation was everything. A man who broke his word or failed to deliver on promises would quickly lose his ability to command respect and collect fees. These early bosses cultivated images as men of honor who could be trusted to keep agreements, even when those agreements involved violence or intimidation. They developed elaborate codes of conduct that distinguished them from common criminals and elevated their status in rural communities. As these territorial groups became more established, they began to formalize their operations. Leaders emerged who could coordinate activities across multiple cosche, settling disputes between groups and preventing the kind of chaotic violence that would attract unwanted government attention. They learned to work within existing social structures rather than against them, often forming alliances with local politicians, clergy, and business leaders who needed their services. The system proved remarkably adaptable to different situations and locations. In areas dominated by sulfur mines, cosche specialized in labor disputes and mine security. Near busy ports, they focused on smuggling and dock activities. In agricultural regions, they concentrated on land management and crop protection. This flexibility allowed the model to spread beyond its original rural base into urban areas where different kinds of protection services were needed. What emerged from this organic growth was something unprecedented in criminal history: parallel government that operated alongside and sometimes instead of official state institutions. These weren't rebels fighting against the existing order. They were entrepreneurs who had discovered how to profit from institutional weakness. They collected taxes, enforced contracts, settled disputes, and maintained public order using methods that were often more effective than those employed by legitimate authorities. Essentially, these early groups functioned as private protection firms, offering services that the weak state couldn't provide. Weak state authority combined with valuable property created demand for private protection. Those protectors coalesced into cosche, offering arbitration and enforcement. Reputation and enforcement made them effective where courts were slow. The business model these early cosche developed would eventually spread far beyond Sicily's shores. The combination of territorial control, protection services, and systematic revenue collection created a template that criminal organizations around the world would adapt to their own circumstances. But in 1860s Sicily, it was simply a practical response to a specific problem: how to maintain order and protect property when traditional institutions had failed. The Sicilian Mafia wasn't planned in some criminal mastermind's headquarters. It evolved from necessity, shaped by geography, economics, and the particular weaknesses of the Italian state in its southern territories. This origin story explains why these organizations always viewed themselves as providing essential services rather than simply committing crimes, and why they could maintain community support even while engaging in activities that clearly violated the law. But as these independent groups multiplied across Sicily, a crucial question emerged about how they would organize themselves. The solution came through a structure that defied conventional criminal logic. Why would the most feared criminal organization deliberately avoid becoming a single, unified army? Most people assume that criminal groups naturally evolve toward centralized control, with one supreme leader commanding absolute obedience from thousands of foot soldiers. The Sicilian Mafia chose the opposite path entirely. Instead of building a pyramid with a single boss at the top, they created something that looked more like a medieval landscape dotted with independent kingdoms, each jealously guarding its own borders and privileges, unlike other criminal groups that sought unity through hierarchy. Cosa Nostra chose a structure that seems almost designed to create internal conflict. By the early 1900s, a loose confederation of about 100 groups, called families or cosche, operated across Sicily, each claiming exclusive rights to specific neighborhoods, towns, or rural districts. These weren't branches of a larger organization reporting to headquarters in Palermo. They were autonomous units that made their own decisions, kept their own profits, and answered to no higher authority except in the most extreme circumstances. This territorial system created a recipe for constant warfare that should have destroyed the organization within a generation. Imagine trying to run a business where every expansion requires negotiating with armed competitors who view any encroachment as an act of war. Each family operated like a small kingdom with clearly defined boundaries that couldn't be crossed without permission. A mafioso from Palermo couldn't conduct business in Catania without first obtaining approval from the local boss, even if that business had nothing to do with the family's core interests. Each family developed its own internal structure that mirrored legitimate organizations while serving criminal purposes. At the top sat the boss, who made final decisions about major operations, territorial disputes, and matters involving life and death. Below him, an underboss handled day-to-day operations and served as the primary liaison with other families. The consigliere filled a role similar to a corporate advisor, offering counsel on complex situations and helping to interpret the unwritten rules that governed mafia behavior. The rank-and-file members were organized into units called decine, traditionally meaning a unit of about 10, but in practice ranging from 5 to 30 members, led by a capodecina who reported directly to the family leadership. These weren't casual gangs thrown together for specific jobs. Each decina operated as a tight unit where members worked together for years, developing the trust and coordination necessary for complex criminal operations. The soldiers within each decina knew each other's strengths, weaknesses, and personal histories, creating bonds that extended far beyond mere business relationships. Associates occupied a different category entirely, working with multiple families without gaining full membership in any single organization. These men provided specialized services: lawyers who could fix court cases, politicians who could influence legislation, businessmen who could launder money through legitimate enterprises. Associates moved freely between territories because they belonged to the broader mafia ecosystem rather than specific families, but they never gained access to the inner secrets or decision-making processes that defined true membership. The territorial system, called borgadas, meant families couldn't expand without stepping directly onto someone else's turf. This created artificial scarcity that prevented any single group from accumulating enough power to dominate the others. A successful family in Palermo might generate enormous profits from their protection rackets and smuggling operations, but they couldn't simply expand into neighboring territories without triggering conflicts that would damage everyone involved. The system forced families to grow vertically within their territories rather than horizontally across Sicily. This decentralized model created both profound strength and dangerous weakness that law enforcement struggled to understand. No single arrest could destroy the entire organization because there was no central command structure to target. When authorities captured a boss, his family continued operating under new leadership, while other families remained completely unaffected. The federal structure meant that even devastating losses in one area didn't compromise operations elsewhere on the island. Powerful bosses like Calogero Vizzini, Salvatore Renna, and Bernardo Provenzano were often called boss of bosses by media. But informants consistently report that this formal title does not exist within the organization itself, but the same independence that protected the organization from external attacks also created internal vulnerabilities. Families developed different approaches to violence, different relationships with legitimate authorities, and different opinions about how openly they should challenge the Italian state. Some bosses preferred subtle corruption and behind-the-scenes influence. Others believed that spectacular violence was necessary to maintain respect and control. These philosophical differences created tensions that periodically erupted into wars that threatened the entire system. The federation structure also made coordination difficult when families needed to respond to external threats or opportunities. Unlike hierarchical organizations that could quickly mobilize resources and personnel, Cosa Nostra required extensive negotiations between independent leaders who each had their own priorities and concerns. A family under attack couldn't automatically count on help from neighboring groups, especially if providing assistance might damage their own interests or violate territorial agreements. The federation structure made Cosa Nostra nearly impossible to eliminate because it operated like a cartel of private protection firms rather than a traditional criminal hierarchy. Each family provided similar services within its territory, but they also specialized based on local opportunities and connections. Palermo families focused on urban protection rackets and political corruption. Rural families concentrated on agricultural protection and cattle rustling. Port families specialized in smuggling and dock operations. This specialization created interdependencies that made cooperation more profitable than conflict. This design choice would prove crucial when law enforcement tried to cut off the head of the organization and discovered there was no single head to target. But the system's greatest challenge wasn't external pressure, it was preventing these armed, territorial, and prideful groups from destroying each other through endless cycles of revenge. The solution came through an institution that seems almost impossible to imagine working in practice. How do you get 100 armed, territorial criminals to follow rules without a police force? The mafia faced a fundamental problem that would have destroyed most organizations before they could establish themselves. Independent families with guns and pride made for explosive combinations, especially when each group viewed any slight as a matter of honor, requiring immediate and violent response. These weren't corporate executives who could settle disputes through lawyers and arbitration panels. These were men who had built their reputations on the willingness to kill anyone who challenged their authority or disrespected their families. Early mafia history was marked by bloody feuds that threatened to destroy the entire system through endless revenge cycles. A typical dispute might start when a member of the Palermo families insulted someone from a Catania group during a business meeting. The insulted party would respond with violence, killing the offender or one of his close associates. This action would trigger retaliation from the Palermo family, who couldn't allow such disrespect to go unpunished without losing face in front of their own members and rival groups. The cycle would continue until entire families had been decimated, taking with them decades of carefully built criminal enterprises and territorial arrangements. These feuds weren't just about personal honor or wounded pride, though those elements certainly played important roles. Each family's ability to command respect and collect protection money depended on maintaining a reputation for swift and decisive action against anyone who crossed them. But when every slight triggered a violent response, the system became unstable. Families spent more time and resources fighting each other than focusing on the profitable criminal activities that made mafia membership attractive in the first place. Provincial and district commissions were formed since the 1950s, with each province having its own commission that served as representative bodies for consultation. These weren't formal institutions with written rules and official procedures. They evolved organically as influential bosses recognized that mediation was more profitable than constant warfare. When tensions arose between families, respected leaders from neutral territories would offer to host meetings where the disputants could present their cases and negotiate solutions. The commission system developed different levels of authority based on geography and the scope of disputes being addressed. Local commissions handled minor conflicts within specific provinces or districts, while regional commissions addressed disputes that affected multiple families or threatened the stability of larger areas. The most serious matters might require special meetings that brought together bosses from across Sicily. Though these gatherings were rare and reserved for threats to the entire organization, these commissions were consultative and limited in power, reflecting the independent nature of mafia families. They couldn't order families around like a military hierarchy or impose decisions that families were unwilling to accept. Instead, they regulated violence and approved sensitive actions, such as killings outside a clan's territory. A successful commission decision had to give both sides something they could present to their members as a victory. Even if neither party got everything they originally wanted, the commission system created rules about when killing was acceptable and when it crossed lines that endangered everyone. Murders that were clearly business-related and targeted appropriate victims were generally acceptable, especially if the perpetrators followed proper protocols about notifying other families and avoiding collateral damage. But violence that brought unwanted police attention, targeted innocent civilians, or violated territorial agreements could trigger commission intervention and potential sanctions against the offending family. Commission meetings themselves followed informal but well understood procedures that emphasized respect and protocol. Bosses would gather in neutral locations, often rural estates or private clubs where they could speak freely without fear of surveillance. Each disputant would present their case, sometimes bringing witnesses or evidence to support their position. The mediating bosses would ask questions, suggest compromise solutions, and work to find arrangements that addressed the underlying interests of all parties involved. Bosses who ignored commission decisions faced isolation and potential elimination by allied families, though enforcement mechanisms developed slowly and weren't always effective. A family that refused to accept a commission ruling might find themselves cut off from profitable partnerships with other groups. Their members might be refused entry to territory controlled by families that supported the commission's decision. In extreme cases, multiple families might coordinate to eliminate leaders who consistently disrupted the system through their refusal to accept mediated settlements. The commission system also served important functions beyond dispute resolution. When external threats emerge, such as increased police pressure or challenges from non-mafia criminal groups, commissions provided forums for coordinating responses that protected everyone's interests. They facilitated information sharing about law enforcement activities, helped families avoid conflicts that might interfere with each other's operations, and established protocols for dealing with members who violated fundamental mafia principles. This delicate balance of autonomy and cooperation created a unique form of criminal governance that had no parallel in legitimate organizations or other criminal enterprises. Families maintained their independence and territorial control while participating in a broader system that regulated their interactions and prevented destructive conflicts. The commission system allowed Cosa Nostra to function as both a collection of independent criminal enterprises and a coordinated network that could respond effectively to challenges and opportunities. The commissions transformed Cosa Nostra from a collection of warring gangs into a sophisticated criminal ecosystem capable of long-term survival. Instead of burning through their human and financial resources in constant warfare, families could focus on developing profitable criminal enterprises that generated steady income over many years. The system created stability that attracted high-quality recruits and facilitated the complex relationships with legitimate businesses and government officials that made mafia operations so profitable. But this institutional framework was only as strong as the men who participated in it. The commission system could regulate disputes and coordinate activities, but it couldn't guarantee loyalty or prevent betrayal from within. So how did these organizations ensure that their members would never break the sacred bonds that held everything together? The answer lay in rituals that transformed ordinary criminals into something entirely different. What happens when a man agrees to join a secret society that considers betrayal worse than murder? The initiation ceremonies weren't just traditions passed down through generations of criminals. They were carefully designed psychological transformations that rewired a person's fundamental loyalties and created bonds stronger than family ties, religious faith, or personal survival instincts. These rituals represented the moment when an ordinary criminal became a man whose identity would forever be defined by his membership in an organization that demanded absolute loyalty until death. New members faced rituals involving actual blood, burning religious images, and oaths that promised death for disloyalty. The ceremonies took place in carefully chosen locations, often remote farmhouses or private rooms where the candidate could be completely isolated from the outside world. This isolation created a controlled environment where the initiate's attention focused entirely on the gravity of the commitment he was making. The men conducting the ceremony spoke in hushed, reverent tones that treated the proceedings as sacred rather than criminal. The ceremony typically required 3 existing members to sponsor a candidate, with one taking personal responsibility for his conduct throughout his entire career in the organization. This sponsorship system created multiple layers of accountability that extended far beyond the initiation itself. The primary sponsor essentially staked his own reputation and sometimes his life on the new member's future behavior. If the initiate later betrayed the organization or violated fundamental rules, the sponsor faced severe consequences that could include death. This created powerful incentives for members to carefully evaluate potential candidates and provide ongoing guidance after initiation. The selection process that preceded the actual ceremony often took months or even years, as existing members observed the candidate's behavior under pressure. They watched how he handled conflicts, whether he kept secrets, how he treated his family, and whether he demonstrated the kind of loyalty and honor that mafia membership required. Men who seemed too eager or who asked too many questions about the organization were automatically disqualified. The ideal candidate was someone who had already proven himself through actions rather than words. A saint's image was placed in the initiate's hands and set on fire while he swore never to betray the organization. The candidate held the burning paper as flames consumed the religious figure, usually Saint Barbara or another saint associated with protection and loyalty, while reciting an oath that bound him to the organization for life. The burning paper symbolized how his soul would burn if he broke his oath, while pricked fingers mixed blood as a sign of brotherhood that created literal kinship between the initiate and his sponsors. These elements served a practical purpose with no paper membership. The ritual provided unambiguous evidence of commitment that could never be disputed or denied. Accounts of these ceremonies come from pentiti, like Tommaso Buscetta and Giovanni Brusca, who gave first-hand descriptions to investigators, along with historical police reports that documented the consistent elements across different families and time periods. The blood ritual involved using a needle or small knife to prick the candidate's finger, usually the trigger finger of his right hand. His blood was mixed with blood from his sponsors, sometimes on the burning saint's image itself. This created a physical bond that many members described as more meaningful than biological family relationships. These rituals created what psychologists call trauma bonding, shared intense experiences that forge powerful group identity and make individuals willing to sacrifice everything for the group's welfare. The combination of fear, reverence, physical pain, and emotional intensity during the ceremony created memories that remained vivid for decades. Members often described their initiation as the most important moment of their lives, more significant than marriage, the birth of children, or any achievement in legitimate society. The ceremony marked their transformation from ordinary men into members of an elite brotherhood with its own moral code and system of justice. The psychological impact was reinforced by the immediate changes in how other members treated the new initiate. Men who had previously kept him at arm's length now shared secrets, included him in important decisions, and treated him as a brother worthy of complete trust. This sudden elevation in status created powerful emotional rewards that reinforced the lessons of the initiation ceremony. The new member learned that his oath had granted him access to a world of respect, power, and opportunity that was completely unavailable to outsiders. But the ceremony was just the beginning of a lifelong commitment governed by unwritten laws that shaped every aspect of a member's existence. The initiate learned that his new identity came with responsibilities that extended far beyond criminal activities. He was expected to mediate disputes between other members, provide financial support to families of imprisoned or killed mafiosi, and maintain the organization's reputation through his personal conduct. His behavior reflected on the entire family, and any disgrace he brought upon himself also damaged his sponsors and associates. The oath also created obligations that sometimes conflicted with personal interests or family welfare. Members were required to prioritize organizational loyalty over business opportunities, personal safety, and even the welfare of their wives and children. Men who tried to leave the organization or reduce their involvement learned that membership was permanent. There was no retirement from Cosa Nostra except through death. This permanence was reinforced through constant reminders of the oath and the consequences of betrayal. Initiation rituals transformed ordinary criminals into men of honor bound by sacred oaths that made betrayal literally unthinkable rather than simply dangerous. The psychological conditioning created during these ceremonies explains why so few mafiosi cooperated with authorities for decades, even when facing life imprisonment or execution. But these sacred bonds were only part of a larger moral framework that governed every aspect of their lives, creating rules that these men followed with religious devotion. These principles formed the foundation of omerta, a complete moral system that governed how these men lived, worked, and died. How could men who murdered for money develop a moral code that they followed more strictly than law-abiding citizens? Follow traffic rules. Omerta was more than silence. Before policet was a social code that discouraged using state institutions. And the law later codified mafia-type associations using omerta as an element. This code created a parallel moral universe where actions that seemed criminal to outsiders were actually expressions of honor, duty, and proper conduct, according to ancient Sicilian traditions that predated the Italian state by centuries. Code created impossible situations where breaking silence meant death. But staying silent often meant watching innocent people suffer without being able to help them or seek justice through legitimate channels. Men bound by omerta found themselves trapped between competing moral obligations that could never be fully resolved. They might witness police brutality against their neighbors, government corruption that destroyed local businesses, or violence against women and children. But they could never cooperate with authorities to address these problems, because doing so would violate the fundamental principle that defined their identity as men of honor. Omerta demanded that mafiosi handle their own disputes without involving police, courts, or any outside authority that might interfere with the organization's internal justice system. This requirement extended far beyond criminal matters to include every kind of conflict that might arise in their personal or professional lives. A mafioso whose business partner cheated him couldn't file a lawsuit or report the fraud to authorities. A member whose wife was threatened by outsiders couldn't call police for protection. Instead, these problems had to be resolved through mafia channels, using methods that reinforced the organization's authority while undermining the legitimacy of state institutions. The enforcement of this principle created a shadow justice system that operated according to its own rules and procedures. When disputes arose between members or between mafiosi and outsiders, The matter would be brought before senior figures who would hear evidence, question witnesses, and render decisions that all parties were expected to accept. These informal courts had no written procedures or appeal processes, but they followed consistent principles about evidence, testimony, and punishment that made their decisions predictable and generally accepted within the criminal community. The code extended to families in ways that turned wives and children of mafiosi into unwilling participants in the organization's culture of secrecy. Women married to members were expected to maintain silence even under intense pressure from police, prosecutors, and journalists who sought information about their husbands' activities. They learned to deflect questions, provide misleading answers, and present themselves as innocent victims who knew nothing about their spouse's criminal involvement. Children grew up understanding that certain topics could never be discussed outside the family and that their father's work required absolute discretion. This family involvement created additional layers of psychological pressure that reinforced the code's power. Men who might have considered cooperating with authorities to save themselves from prison faced the knowledge that betrayal would destroy their entire families. Their wives would be ostracized from their communities, their children would be marked as traitors, and their extended families would face social and economic consequences that could last for generations. The code made betrayal a crime against blood relatives rather than just criminal associates. Violations weren't just punished by death of the individual who broke omerta. Relatives of turncoats were at times targeted prosecutorial testimony. Documents, murders of families, of penty making, the cost of betrayal extremely high. In cases like that of Francesco Manoia, family members were murdered after his cooperation with authorities, demonstrating how the organization extended punishment beyond the individual traitor. This practice reflected the mafia's understanding that loyalty was learned in childhood and passed down through generations. If a man's betrayal was seen as reflecting his family's moral character rather than just his individual weakness, then his relatives posed a potential threat that needed to be addressed. The systematic nature of these reprisals served multiple purposes beyond simple revenge. They demonstrated to other members that the consequences of betrayal extended far beyond personal death to include the destruction of everything a man might care about more than his own life. They eliminated potential witnesses who might have intimate knowledge of the traitor's activities and motivations. Most importantly, they reinforced the idea that mafia membership created obligations that transcended individual choice or personal circumstances. The written rules discovered in 2007 revealed the extent to which these moral principles had been codified into specific behavioral requirements that governed daily life. The Ten Commandments included seemingly minor details, like never being late for appointments and always telling the truth to other members, alongside more serious prohibitions against cooperating with authorities or engaging in unauthorized violence. These rules showed how the code penetrated every aspect of a member's existence, creating standards of conduct that were often more demanding than those expected of legitimate businessmen or government officials. The requirement for punctuality reflected deeper values about respect and reliability that defined honorable behavior within the organization. A man who couldn't be trusted to arrive on time for meetings might also be unreliable in more serious matters involving life and death. The prohibition against lying to fellow members, created an internal culture of honesty that contrasted sharply with the deception that characterized the organization's relationships with outsiders. This moral framework created a parallel justice system that competed directly with the Italian state for legitimacy and authority. Citizens living in mafia territories often found the organization's courts more accessible, efficient, and reliable than official institutions. Disputes that might take years to resolve through legitimate channels could be settled within days through mafia mediation, creating practical incentives for people to bypass state institutions, even when they weren't directly involved in criminal activities. Omerta transformed the mafia from a criminal gang into a shadow society with its own courts, laws, and moral authority that commanded genuine respect from many Sicilians. But this elaborate code of honor served a deeper purpose than maintaining internal discipline. It provided the foundation for a business model that would prove far more profitable and enduring than simple theft or violence. The foundation they built rested on a business model that transformed violence into a regulated industry with predictable profits. What if the mafia's greatest innovation wasn't violence, but creating a market for something that shouldn't need to be bought? Most people think of protection rackets as simple extortion schemes, where criminals demand money in exchange for not hurting their victims. The reality was far more sophisticated and economically brilliant. The protection racket operated on a twisted but effective economic principle that would make any business school professor pause in admiration, even while recognizing its fundamentally corrupt nature. The system worked by creating artificial demand for security services, then positioning themselves as the exclusive supplier of those services within specific territories. Businesses faced a cruel paradox, where paying protection money was both extortion and genuine insurance against very real threats that the mafia itself had helped create. Shop owners in neighborhoods controlled by Cosa Nostra knew that refusing to pay the pizzo meant facing immediate consequences. Their windows might be smashed, their customers intimidated, or their supply chains disrupted through mysterious accidents and delays. But paying the monthly fee actually did provide real protection against other criminal groups, random thieves, and various forms of harassment that plagued businesses in areas where police protection was unreliable or corrupt. Mafiosi established territorial monopolies, where they became the only source of security and dispute resolution in their areas, eliminating competition through methods that legitimate businesses could never employ. When rival protection groups tried to move into established mafia territories, they faced swift and decisive responses that made clear the costs of challenging existing arrangements. This wasn't just about intimidating competitors, it required maintaining relationships with local businesses that went beyond simple fear-based compliance. The mafia's protection was both coercive and at times genuinely used by clients, especially criminals who needed guarantors of trust in illegal transactions where courts couldn't settle disputes. The system created artificial scarcity by making safety a commodity that could only be purchased from one supplier, much like a utility company that holds exclusive rights to provide electricity or water to specific neighborhoods. Business owners couldn't shop around for better deals or negotiate prices based on competitive offers. They paid the rates established by their territorial mafia family or faced consequences that made compliance the only rational choice. This monopoly power allowed mafiosi to set prices based on what the market would bear, rather than competitive pressures or actual costs. The pricing structure revealed sophisticated understanding of local economics that would impress legitimate business analysts. Empirical studies found that the peso was regressive. Small firms could pay as much as 40% of their operating profits, while large enterprises paid as little as 2% of their revenue. This wasn't random exploitation, it reflected careful calculation of each business's ability to pay and the relative risks of pushing them toward bankruptcy or rebellion. Small shopkeepers had fewer alternatives and less political influence, making them ideal targets for maximum extraction. Large corporations and established businesses received better rates because they possessed resources to resist connections to legitimate authorities, an economic importance that made destroying them counterproductive. A major employer that provided hundreds of jobs couldn't be pushed too hard without triggering government intervention that would threaten the entire protection system. These larger clients also generated steady, predictable revenue streams that made them valuable long-term assets rather than short-term profit opportunities. This regressive taxation system trapped small entrepreneurs and prevented economic development in mafia territories by creating barriers to business growth that didn't exist in areas with effective law enforcement. Young entrepreneurs who might have expanded successful small businesses into larger enterprises found themselves caught in cycles where increased revenue led to higher protection payments that consumed most of their profits. The system essentially capped economic development at levels that maximized mafia revenue while preventing businesses from growing large enough to challenge their authority. The racket worked because mafiosi provided real services alongside their demands for payment. They really did protect businesses from other criminals who might rob them or vandalize their property. They settled commercial disputes quickly and efficiently when legitimate courts were slow, corrupt, or inaccessible. They provided informal credit and mediation services that helped small businesses navigate complex relationships with suppliers, customers, and competitors. These genuine benefits made the protection payments seem like legitimate business expenses rather than pure extortion. Business owners often found themselves genuinely grateful for mafia intervention in disputes or protection from threats, even while recognizing the fundamental corruption of the system. A shopkeeper whose stolen goods were recovered within days through mafia connections might grudgingly admit that the protection fee had provided real value. A restaurant owner whose disruptive customer problem was resolved through intimidation rather than lengthy police procedures might acknowledge the efficiency of mafia justice, despite its obviously illegal nature. The psychological aspects of this relationship created complex dynamics that went beyond simple, fear-based compliance. Many business owners developed personal relationships with their mafia contacts that included elements of genuine respect and mutual dependence. The local mafioso might attend family celebrations, provide advice on business decisions, or help resolve personal problems that had nothing to do with protection services. This business model proved so successful that it spread far beyond Sicily's borders, adapted to different cultural and economic contexts while maintaining its core structure of territorial control and monopolistic service provision. The protection racket transformed violence from a tool of crime into regulated industry with predictable profits and territorial boundaries that could be maintained over generations. This economic foundation made the mafia nearly impossible to eliminate because they provided services that people actually needed in environments where legitimate institutions had failed. But what made men accept such a world? The answer required understanding how these men constructed identities that allowed them to see themselves as society's protectors rather than its predators. Mafiosi didn't view themselves as criminals operating outside moral boundaries. They genuinely believed they were honorable men, providing essential services that incompetent governments and corrupt officials couldn't deliver. This wasn't clever public relations or cynical manipulation of public opinion. These men had constructed elaborate moral frameworks that allowed them to sleep peacefully at night, while knowing they had ordered murders, collected extortion payments, and terrorized entire communities. This self-image created psychological tensions that required constant mental adjustment. But the rewards made the effort worthwhile. Every mafioso learned to divide the world into categories that justified his actions and preserved his self-respect. Violence against other criminals was acceptable because those men had chosen to enter a world where death was an occupational hazard. Extortion from businesses was legitimate taxation because the state couldn't provide adequate security. Intimidation of witnesses was necessary protection of the organization's ability to function. Murder of traitors was justice rather than revenge, because betrayal violated sacred oaths that deserved severe consequences. The title, Man of Honor, came with strict behavioral codes about protecting women, keeping promises, and showing respect. Two elders that created genuine moral obligations alongside criminal activities. These weren't empty gestures designed to fool outsiders. Mafiosi who violated these codes faced real consequences from their own organizations, sometimes including expulsion or death for crimes that had nothing to do with business interests. A man who mistreated his wife, cheated his friends, or showed disrespect to elderly relatives could find himself stripped of his position and expelled from the brotherhood that defined his identity. The code required specific behaviors that distinguished mafiosi from common criminals who operated without moral constraints. They couldn't steal from churches or rob from widows and orphans. They couldn't engage in prostitution or drug dealing that corrupted young people. They couldn't use violence against women or children except in extraordinary circumstances that threatened the organization's survival. These restrictions weren't just tactical decisions designed to avoid public backlash. They represented genuine moral beliefs that many members followed even when breaking them would have been profitable and safe. Mafiosi distinguished themselves from common criminals by following rules about when violence was acceptable and when it crossed moral lines that even killers shouldn't cross. Professional murders had to serve legitimate purposes like eliminating traitors, settling territorial disputes, or responding to disrespect that threatened the organization's authority. Random violence, crimes of passion, or killings motivated by personal greed were forbidden because they brought unwanted attention and violated the honor code that justified their existence. Members who engaged in unauthorized violence faced internal discipline that could be more severe than punishment from external authorities. They saw themselves as filling gaps left by an incompetent state that couldn't provide justice, security, and order where these services were desperately needed. In their view, the Italian government had failed its citizens by creating legal systems that were slow, corrupt, and ineffective. Police forces were understaffed and unreliable. Courts took years to resolve disputes that could be settled in days through mafia mediation. Politicians made promises they never intended to keep while enriching themselves at public expense. The mafiosi positioned themselves as practical men who solved real problems through direct action. This worldview allowed them to see protection rackets as legitimate taxation for essential services rather than criminal extortion. Business owners who paid monthly fees received actual security, dispute resolution, and access to networks that helped their enterprises succeed. The payments weren't arbitrary demands for money. They were fees for services that the legitimate government couldn't or wouldn't provide. From this perspective, the mafiosi were entrepreneurs who had identified market demand for security services and built successful businesses around meeting that demand. The honor system created hierarchies based on reputation rather than just fear, with respected bosses earning genuine loyalty from subordinates who admired their leadership qualities and moral character. Men rose through mafia ranks not just because they were willing to use violence, but because they demonstrated wisdom, fairness, and commitment to the organization's values. The most successful leaders were those who could resolve conflicts without bloodshed, build profitable criminal enterprises that lasted for decades, and maintain respect from both their criminal associates and legitimate community members. This moral framework allowed mafiosi to maintain family relationships and community standing despite their criminal activities, creating dual identities that seemed contradictory to outsiders but made perfect sense to the men who lived them. They attended church regularly, supported local charities, and participated in community celebrations while running criminal organizations that terrorized the same communities. Their neighbors often viewed them with a mixture of fear and respect, recognizing their criminal activities while appreciating the order and security they provided. The initiation process often reprioritized loyalties, with many members describing the bond as equal to or above family ties. This psychological transformation helps explain why pentiti were so rare for decades. The cost of betraying the organization was extreme, extending beyond personal consequences to include social ostracism and threats to loved ones. The men of honor identity gave the mafia moral legitimacy that pure criminal organizations could never achieve, allowing them to embed themselves in Sicilian society as an alternative social order with its own values and traditions. But this carefully constructed balance between honor and violence would face unprecedented challenges when ambitious leaders decided that traditional rules were obstacles to greater power and profit. How did a rural family overcome powerful urban clans? The answer: deliberate infiltration, bribery, and targeted elimination. What happens when a small-town mafia family decides to conquer an entire criminal empire through pure brutality? The answer emerged in the 1970s, when the most audacious power grab in mafia history began in an unlikely place. Corleone was a dusty agricultural town in the hills southeast of Palermo, far from the sophisticated criminal networks that dominated Sicily's major cities. Its narrow streets wound between ancient stone buildings, where farmers sold their crops and shepherds brought their flocks to market. The local mafia family seemed insignificant compared to the powerful organizations controlling Palermo's ports, Catania's businesses, or the sulfur mines that generated enormous profits across the island, led by Salvatore Renna, known to everyone as Toto. The Corleonesi violated every traditional rule about measured violence and territorial respect that had governed Cosa Nostra for over a century. Where other families used violence as a last resort after negotiation and mediation had failed, the Corleonesi made it their first choice. Where traditional mafiosi killed specific targets for specific reasons, Rena's men eliminated anyone who might pose future problems. Where established families respected territorial boundaries and sought commission approval for major actions, the Corleonesi acted unilaterally and expanded wherever they saw opportunity. The Corleonesi started as a minor family from this rural town, controlling cattle rustling, crop protection, and small-scale extortion in an area that most Palermo bosses considered barely worth their attention. The territory generated modest profits from agricultural protection rackets and provided a steady supply of tough, loyal men who understood violence as a daily reality rather than an occasional business necessity. These weren't sophisticated, urban criminals who wore expensive suits and maintained elaborate social facades. They were hard men from the countryside who had learned that problems were solved through direct action rather than complex negotiations. Under Luciano Leggio and later Rena, they developed a strategy of systematic elimination that shocked even hardened mafiosi who had spent their entire careers in an organization built around violence. Leggio, who led the family before Rena took control, established the philosophical foundation for what would become total war against the traditional mafia establishment. He believed that the old bosses had grown soft and complacent, more interested in maintaining comfortable arrangements than maximizing power and profits. Leggio saw weakness where others saw stability, and he taught his followers that mercy was a luxury that ambitious men couldn't afford. Rena perfected these lessons into a methodology that treated murder as a strategic tool rather than an emotional response. He studied other families' structures, identified their key members, and planned elimination campaigns that would prevent effective retaliation. His approach wasn't random violence or crime of passion killing. It was systematic warfare conducted with military precision and strategic thinking that anticipated his enemies' responses before they could formulate them. The Corleonesi forged a coalition and used bribery and subversion to dominate the traditional power structure. They targeted not just rival bosses, but entire family structures, eliminating potential revenge seekers before they could act. This represented a fundamental departure from traditional mafia practice, where killing a boss might satisfy honor requirements and solve immediate problems. Rena understood that leaving relatives and close associates alive created future enemies who would spend years planning their own revenge. His solution was comprehensive elimination that removed not just immediate threats, but anyone who might pose problems months or years later. Traditional mafia diplomacy gave way to preemptive strikes as the Corleonesi decided negotiation was weakness. That gave enemies time to prepare defenses or seek alliances, where other families might spend weeks or months discussing territorial disputes through commission mediators. Rina's men acted immediately to secure their objectives through violence. They eliminated rivals before those rivals knew they were targets, striking without warning and without the lengthy preliminary discussions that characterize traditional mafia conflicts. Their rise coincided with the lucrative heroin trade, giving them resources to fund an unprecedented war machine that could sustain prolonged campaigns against multiple enemies simultaneously. The 1970s brought enormous profits from drug trafficking that dwarfed traditional protection rackets and provided the financial foundation for military-style operations, unlike other families that maintained their historic revenue streams. The Corleonesi recognized that drug money could buy weapons, safe houses, and loyalty on a scale that made conventional mafia operations seem primitive. Drug trafficking also attracted a different type of recruit than traditional mafia activities. Men willing to risk everything for enormous profits were often more ruthless and less bound by traditional codes than those who had grown up in established mafia families. The Corleonesi recruited these men aggressively, building an organization that combined rural toughness with urban sophistication and international connections that gave them advantages over territorially bound, traditional families. The heroin trade created networks that extended far beyond Sicily to include American crime families, Turkish suppliers, and European distribution systems. These connections gave the Corleonesi resources and intelligence that traditional families couldn't match. They learned about police investigations before raids happened, discovered which politicians could be bought, and identified which competitors posed the greatest threats to their operations. This campaign produced hundreds of murders and led to the Corleonesi gaining control of the commission, with many bosses being replaced or killed. The Corleonesi revolution proved that even ancient criminal traditions could be overthrown by those willing to use systematic violence against anyone who stood in their way. Rina's success established him as the closest thing to a boss of bosses that Cosa Nostra had ever seen, controlling territory and operations that previous leaders could never have imagined, consolidating under single authority. But this transformation from traditional criminal organization into something far more dangerous would soon spiral beyond even Rina's control, threatening to destroy the very empire he had built through blood and terror. The violence that followed would test whether any criminal organization could survive when it abandoned the very principles that had allowed it to thrive for over a century. How did a criminal organization that prided itself on order and tradition nearly destroy itself in an orgy of violence? The Second Mafia War wasn't just about territory or drug profits, though both played important roles in the carnage that followed. This was a fight for the soul of Cosa Nostra itself, a philosophical battle between those who believed the organization should remain a shadow government operating through subtle influence and corruption, and those who thought spectacular violence could intimidate the Italian state into complete submission. The conflict exposed fundamental disagreements about the mafia's future that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. Hundreds of deaths resulted as the Corleonesi systematically eliminated rivals, allies, and anyone who might pose future threats to their vision of centralized control under Rina's leadership. The killing began with targeted assassinations of specific bosses who had opposed Corleonesi expansion into drug trafficking and lucrative urban territories. But the campaign quickly escalated beyond traditional mafia violence, as entire families were marked for elimination to prevent future revenge cycles. The Corleonesi developed hit lists that included not just active opponents, but also their relatives, close friends, and business associates who might inherit their grudges or territorial claims. They killed old men who had retired from active criminal participation, young men who had never held significant positions in rival families, and even some women who were related to targeted bosses. This wholesale slaughter violated every traditional rule about proportionate response and appropriate targets that had governed mafia conflicts for generations. Traditional families found themselves fighting a war they didn't understand against enemies who refused to follow established rules about negotiation, mediation, and measured retaliation. Bosses who tried to arrange peace talks through commission mediators discovered that the Corleonesi viewed such approaches as signs of weakness rather than opportunities for honorable settlement. Men who had built their reputations on diplomatic skills and strategic patience found themselves helpless against opponents who shot first and never bothered with questions. The violence escalated beyond criminal targets to include journalists, police officials, and politicians who opposed them or investigated their activities too aggressively. This expansion of targets represented a fundamental shift in mafia strategy that shocked even hardened criminals who had spent their careers avoiding conflicts with state authorities. Previous generations of mafiosi had understood that killing government officials brought unwanted attention and resources that made criminal operations more difficult and dangerous. Rina's faction calculated that intimidating the government through spectacular violence would force authorities to back down and accept mafia dominance in exchange for reduced bloodshed. They believed that Italian politicians and police officials were fundamentally cowardly and would choose accommodation over confrontation if the costs of resistance became too high. This strategy required violence dramatic enough to capture national attention and demonstrate the futility of opposing Corleonesi power. Car bombs exploded in city centers, abandoning the traditional mafia practice of conducting violence in remote locations away from public view. Bodies were left in prominent places where they would be discovered quickly and photographed by news media, rather than being disposed of discreetly in rural areas where they might never be found. The Corleonesi wanted their violence to be visible, shocking, and undeniably connected to their organization's power. Traditional mafia rules about avoiding attention crumbled as the war revealed deep philosophical divisions about whether the organization should remain a shadow network operating through corruption and intimidation, or transform itself into something resembling a terrorist organization that openly challenged state authority. Conservative bosses argued that publicity was dangerous and that successful criminals should remain invisible to both law enforcement and the general public. They believed that the organization's strength came from its ability to influence events. Without being directly connected to them, the war created disruption that extended beyond the criminal underworld into legitimate businesses, political institutions, and daily life across Sicily. Protection rackets became unreliable as businesses couldn't determine which family controlled their territories, or whether their payments were going to organizations that might be eliminated before the month was over. Politicians who had maintained Relationships with specific mafia families found themselves caught between competing demands from groups that might kill them for making the wrong choice. The killing became so widespread that even loyal Corleonesi members sometimes weren't sure whether specific murders had been authorized by their leadership or carried out by subordinates who were interpreting orders too broadly. The campaign expanded to include allies who weren't enthusiastic enough about their leadership, neutral families who refused to choose sides, and anyone whose continued existence seemed inconvenient to their consolidation of power. This strategy produced hundreds of deaths, public outrage, and a major state crackdown that would fundamentally alter the relationship between organized crime and Italian society. The Second Mafia War transformed Cosa Nostra from a secretive criminal network into something that the Italian state could no longer ignore or tolerate through unofficial arrangements. The bloodshed created conditions that would force both the mafia and the government into a confrontation that neither side had originally wanted, but that had become inevitable once the violence crossed certain lines that couldn't be uncrossed. The Italian state responded with unprecedented legal firepower that would test whether democratic institutions could defeat organized crime through courtroom proceedings rather than street warfare. What happens when an entire criminal empire faces justice in the largest organized crime trial in world history? The answer began taking shape in a specially constructed bunker courtroom in Palermo, where the Maxi trial indicted 475 alleged mafiosi and resulted in 338 convictions, confirmed by Italy's Supreme Court. The courtroom itself looked more like a military installation than a traditional judicial venue, with reinforced concrete walls designed to withstand bomb attacks and armed guards positioned at every entrance. The defendants sat in metal cages that stretched across the entire width of the room, creating a visual spectacle that captured international attention and symbolized the Italian state's determination to confront organized crime through legal proceedings rather than negotiated accommodation. For the first time in over a century, the Italian state was fighting back with the same systematic approach the mafia used against its enemies. Instead of targeting individual criminals for specific crimes, prosecutors Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino constructed a comprehensive case that treated Cosa Nostra as a single criminal conspiracy. Their approach required years of painstaking investigation that mapped the organization's structure, documented its activities, and identified the relationships between families that had previously seemed like separate criminal groups to law enforcement officials who lacked detailed knowledge of mafia operations. Falcone and Borsellino understood something that previous prosecutors had missed. The mafia's strength came from its organizational structure rather than just the criminal activities of individual members. They built cases that focused on proving the existence of the organization itself, demonstrating how families cooperated, how commissions functioned, and how territorial agreements governed criminal activities across Sicily. This required evidence that went far beyond documenting specific murders or extortion schemes to include proof of the institutional framework that made systematic criminal activity possible. The breakthrough came when several mafiosi broke omerta for the first time in the organization's history, providing testimony that revealed internal operations prosecutors had only guessed at through surveillance and intelligence gathering. Tommaso Buscetta, and other turncoats provided the structural testimony that made convictions possible by revealing how the organization actually functioned from the inside. Their willingness to testify represented a fundamental crack in the psychological foundations that had protected the organization for generations. Buscetta's testimony alone provided prosecutors with organizational charts that showed how families related to each other, how commissions operated, and how decisions were made at the highest levels of the criminal hierarchy. He described initiation ceremonies, explained territorial arrangements, and identified hundreds of individuals who held specific positions within various families. This information transformed scattered criminal intelligence into a comprehensive picture of a criminal enterprise that operated like a shadow government across much of Sicily. The trial revealed the internal structure of Cosa Nostra in unprecedented detail, confirming what investigators had only suspected about the organization's scope and sophistication. Prosecutors presented evidence that showed how families coordinated drug trafficking operations, divided territorial control, and resolved disputes through commission meetings that functioned like corporate board meetings. They documented how the organization had evolved from rural protection rackets into an international criminal enterprise that generated billions of dollars through drug trafficking, money laundering, and systematic corruption of legitimate institutions. The evidence included telephone intercepts, financial records, and testimony from law enforcement officials who had spent years investigating specific aspects of mafia operations. Prosecutors showed how legitimate businesses had been infiltrated, how public contracts were manipulated, and how political corruption facilitated criminal activities that extended far beyond traditional extortion and violence. The trial painted a picture of an organization that had penetrated virtually every aspect of Sicilian society and maintained its power through a combination of violence, corruption, and economic control. When the verdicts were announced, after 6 years of proceedings, the convictions represented the largest legal defeat in Cosa Nostra's history. The sentences ranged from short prison terms for minor figures to life imprisonment for bosses who had ordered multiple murders. The convictions included men who had been considered untouchable by previous generations of prosecutors and demonstrated that the Italian judicial system could successfully prosecute complex organized crime cases when provided with adequate resources and political support. But Rina's response was characteristically brutal and demonstrated his fundamental misunderstanding of how democratic societies respond to terrorist attacks on their institutions. Both Falcone and Borsellino were assassinated by massive car bombs in 1992 that killed not just the prosecutors but also their security details and innocent bystanders. Falcone was killed in the Capaci bombing on May 23, 1992, when explosives planted under a highway detonated as his armored car passed overhead. Borsellino died in the Via D'Amelio bombing on July 19, 1992, along with 5 police officers who were part of his protection detail. These murders provoked public outrage and accelerated government crackdown, culminating in Rina's 1993 arrest. The assassinations shocked a nation that had grown accustomed to mafia violence, but had never seen such direct attacks on the judicial system itself. Politicians who had previously sought accommodation with criminal organizations found themselves forced to support harsh anti-mafia legislation that gave prosecutors unprecedented powers to investigate and prosecute organized crime. the organization that had survived fascist suppression, Allied occupation, and decades of half-hearted law enforcement efforts, faced its greatest existential crisis as public opinion turned decisively against any form of accommodation with criminal organizations that challenged democratic institutions through terrorism. The Maxi trial proved that the Mafia's greatest weakness was its own success in becoming too visible and too powerful to ignore. Rina's capture marked the end of the Corleonesi era, but it also created a leadership vacuum that would require entirely new approaches to criminal organization and survival. Bernardo Provenzano stepped into this chaos with a completely different vision for how criminal organizations should operate in the modern world. How did a fugitive hiding in the Sicilian countryside rebuild a shattered criminal empire using nothing but handwritten notes? Provenzano faced a challenge that would have destroyed most organizations and ended the careers of lesser men. The Mafia that Rina left behind was a smoking ruin of what it had been just a decade earlier. Families had been decimated by internal wars and mass arrests. Public opinion had turned completely against the organization. Politicians who had once maintained quiet relationships with Mafia bosses now competed to demonstrate their anti-credentials. The new boss had to completely reverse decades of violent confrontation while maintaining control over fractured families that had grown accustomed to solving problems through immediate and brutal force. Provenzano understood something that Rina never grasped about the relationship between criminal organizations and the societies they operated within. Spectacular violence might intimidate individual enemies, but it ultimately strengthened the state by creating public demand for effective law enforcement and giving politicians the political cover they needed to fund aggressive anti-crime campaigns. Provenzano's approach represented what became known as Pax Mafiosa philosophical revolution that rejected everything the Corleonesi had stood for during their rise to power. He halted public terrorism and shifted to quiet corruption and restoration of support funds that could generate steady profits without triggering massive law enforcement responses. Where Rina had used car bombs and assassinations to terrorize opponents, Provenzano preferred patient infiltration of legitimate institutions. Where the previous leadership had sought immediate dominance through overwhelming force, the new strategy focused on long-term influence that would be harder to detect and more difficult to prosecute. He communicated through an elaborate system of handwritten pizzini, tiny coded messages passed through trusted couriers who often didn't know the contents of what they carried or the people they served. This low-tech, coded system helped bosses communicate while avoiding surveillance that had grown increasingly sophisticated. Since the Maxi trial, these messages were written on scraps of paper, small enough to be easily hidden and quickly destroyed if discovery seemed imminent. The language was deliberately obscure, using references to farming, religious ceremonies, and family events to discuss criminal activities that might have resulted in life sentences. If law enforcement officials had been able to decode their true meaning, the Pizzini system allowed Provenzano to maintain control over scattered criminal operations while remaining completely invisible to surveillance efforts. Police could intercept phone calls, monitor bank accounts, and track the movements of known criminals. But they struggled to penetrate a communication network that relied on personal relationships, coded language, and couriers who looked like ordinary farmers or shopkeepers going about their daily business. The new approach focused on rebuilding financial networks that could generate steady profits without attracting the attention that had made drug trafficking so dangerous during the previous decade. Instead of importing heroin from Turkey and shipping it to New York, Provenzano's families concentrated on corrupting public contracts, manipulating construction projects, and infiltrating legitimate businesses that provided cover for money laundering operations. These activities generated smaller profits per transaction, but created sustainable income streams that could continue for years without triggering major investigations. Public contracts became the new frontier for mafia infiltration as families learned to manipulate bidding processes, influence contract awards, and extract percentages from projects funded by European Union development money flowing into southern Italy. The profits were enormous and the risks were manageable because corruption cases moved slowly through Italian courts and rarely resulted in the kind of life sentences that drug trafficking charges could bring. Construction companies that wanted to participate in these projects learned to factor mafia taxes into their bidding calculations. Murders of state officials virtually stopped as Provenzano convinced families that invisibility was their greatest weapon against a government that had demonstrated its willingness to mobilize enormous resources in response to direct challenges. The new leader understood that killing judges and prosecutors had transformed the mafia from a criminal organization into a national security threat that justified extraordinary law enforcement measures. By avoiding such provocative acts, he hoped to return Cosa Nostra to its traditional role as a regional problem that could be managed through conventional policing rather than military-style operations. He rebuilt the commission system and restored territorial boundaries that had collapsed during the Corleonesi wars, creating stability that allowed individual families to focus on developing their criminal enterprises rather than fighting for survival against rivals who might eliminate them. Without warning, the restoration of traditional structures gave younger mafiosi a sense that the organization had a future and that loyalty and patience would be rewarded through advancement within established hierarchies. This strategy proved so successful that many believed the mafia had disappeared entirely from areas where it had once dominated every aspect of economic and political life. Journalists who had covered the organization for decades wrote articles suggesting that aggressive law enforcement had finally destroyed Cosa Nostra as an effective criminal force. Politicians celebrated the apparent victory over organized crime and redirected resources toward other priorities that seemed more pressing than monitoring the activities of criminals who appeared to have been neutralized. The apparent disappearance was exactly what Provenzano had intended to achieve through his patient reconstruction of an organization that had learned painful lessons about the costs of challenging state authority through spectacular violence. His strategy demonstrated that criminal organizations, like legitimate businesses, could adapt to changing market conditions and regulatory environments by modifying their operational methods while preserving their core functions. Provenzano was arrested in 2006 after 43 years on the run, but the organizational principles he established continue to influence how Cosa Nostra operates in an environment where traditional methods have become counterproductive. His Pax Mafiosa proved that the mafia's true power lay not in violence, but in its ability to adapt and evolve while maintaining the fundamental structures that had allowed it to survive for over a century. The system Provenzano perfected represents something far more significant than criminal innovation. The Ten Commandments discovered in that hideout weren't just rules. They were the DNA of an organization that survived everything from fascist suppression to modern surveillance by understanding that true power comes from structure, not violence. Today's Cosa Nostra operates with encrypted communications and digital finance, but still follows the same principles of territorial control, ritual loyalty, and adaptive governance that emerged in 19th century Sicily. Cosa Nostra adapted by combining territorial control, ritualized loyalty, and pragmatic governance, which helps explain both its resilience and why the state had to change tactics. If this calm, structured history helped you unwind and learn, consider subscribing for more relaxed history narratives the next time you hear about organized crime anywhere in the world. Remember that structure ultimately proved more powerful than spectacle.